Michael, I want to ask you, it looks like the carbon tax is here to stay now. How have the provinces who challenged the policy responded to the Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, I would say overall, it's been a very encouraging set of responses from the provinces. So the one who's provided the most detail so far is Premier Scott Moe in Saskatchewan. And he's indicated that he's going to put in place his own system, likely, although we don't have the details yet, reducing some fuel taxes to compensate for the extra costs from the carbon tax. Jason Kenney himself has said he's going to look at a variety of options, and his main criteria is going to be to keep costs low for households. And Doug Ford, interestingly, has not responded yet, but I actually take that to be a positive signal because he has been very vocal in the past about his opposition to the policy. So the fact that he's taken some time to consider his options, I hope is a constructive sign.
Aaron, what's your view on the responses from provincial leaders and what this means for sort of some of the conflicts between, the West, the Western Canadians and the federal government?
Yeah, it certainly puts the premiers on the spot. They have to make a decision. Do they stick with what Mr. Trudeau has imposed on them, or do they try and come up with something else that also imposes a cost, but that, in their view is going to impose less cost? And if you look at Scott Moe as the example that Michael mentioned, he's looking at New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. And what I find interesting there is that those provinces introduced a system which don't strictly meet the lower threshold that the backstop sets. And yet Justin Trudeau and the federal government allowed them to proceed with those plans. So it's going to be interesting to see if they allow a province like Saskatchewan to also apply a similar approach, which technically puts them below the threshold, but that the Trudeau government accepts anyway.
Michael, what's your view on the future for policies like this? Is the carbon tax here to stay, or is it, perhaps subject to the whims of whoever is elected into office?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful it's here to stay. I think that the key missing piece here is what the Conservative Party, both the premiers as well as the federal party, choose to do. But the reality is, if we're going to do something about climate change, we know this is the most small c conservative way to go because it puts the power in the hands of the private sector rather than government, and it keeps costs low. So to me, I think there's a very strong likelihood that we will see this policy endure for the long term.
Now, Aaron, how do you push back against a law like this now that it's been upheld as constitutional? And what's next for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation?
Well, Christine, we've always taken a sort of two-pronged approach, right? We disagree with it on policy, and we disagree with it that it was constitutional. Obviously, one of those avenues has been closed. The Supreme Court has ruled on that. We accept that. But just because you're allowed to do something doesn't mean you have to do it or that it's necessarily a good idea. And so we'll continue to make those arguments.
And Aaron, do you have a reaction to what the court held on calling it a tax or not a tax?
Look, yeah, you can call it whatever you want, a levy, a regulatory charge. It's interesting because, proponents like to call it a price, opponents call it a tax. I think to the average Canadian, it doesn't make much of a difference. If it's money that you don't have to spend, that you used to have to spend, you can call it whatever you want. I don't see people starting to call it an income price anytime soon, for example.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the effect is that people are paying this money, whether they are getting it back for now is a different matter. And certainly it requires some faith in the government that they continue to keep this as a revenue neutral tool and don't see it as another revenue raising opportunity.